So I want to talk now about U.S. environmental policy. You might be saying at this point, "Dear Professor, I took anthropology so I could learn about far-off cultures in distant lands with worldviews dramatically different than my own. Why do you keep making me learn about boring U.S. environmental policy? I'm trying to get away from this place, in my brain at least. And are you evil?" The answer is maybe. I mean, who's to say? But also no. I'm doing this for good reasons. Number one, it sets the ethnographic stage. What I mean by that is the context within which culture and ecology works today. It was great that Roy Rappaport did that study that showed that the Tsemberig and the pigs and the Kaiko festival all had this like perfect, intertwined, like balanced ecosystem. And it's great that Julian Stewart showed us something somewhat similarly with Goshute people in the Great Basin in the 1800s. But the fact of the matter is that nowadays there's almost no parts of the world that don't have politics and policy affecting them. Whether that's for good or bad, or as is very often the case, somewhere in between, right? Even if it's just that an NGO has come in and bought up land so that it could be protected, right? That's still an effect of policy where you can't fully think of the indigenous group's interactions with that space without also considering the bigger political framework. So, that's one reason. It sets the stage. We can't be good students of culture and ecology without considering politics and policy. Number two, it's very, very relevant to your careers. As I've said many times before, going into NGOs, you need to know the policies and what they make possible and what they don't make possible. Going into government, policies run your life. Going into consulting, policies indirectly run your life because now you're trying to help other people comply with laws and policies, and on and on and on. Activism, now you need to understand the policies and laws because they're one of your most important tools for trying to make positive, at least in your view, environmental change. Private sector, you need to know policies and laws so you can properly follow them. So it's critical to know in a lot of careers. And that's true if you're going to work in the US, but I would argue that that's also true if you're not. US environmental policy is useful to study because it has been somewhat influential on the global stage. It may surprise you to know, but in the 60s and 70s, the US was rather ahead of its time with certain kinds of environmental laws. And so some of the other laws that came about in other countries bear sort of influences or hints of US laws, because obviously governments are, they're like that kid in math class who's looking at the other person's test, right? Governments also often look at each other to see things that are working or not working, or that would or wouldn't work in their context. So you'll sometimes see laws that sort of look like the US's and sort of don't. Canada's version of NEPA, Canada has a version of that. Canada's version of Endangered Species Act is a good example. It looks very similar. It does have one huge difference. One huge difference is that the provincial government, the Canadian government, can essentially designate certain species preservation as being outweighed by a lot of by economic and political factors of just being unfeasible. That is not something I'm saying happens all the time, but it can happen. Even if the Science Council makes a certain recommendation, the government can kind of say, well, that's not really feasible. In the US, in theory, we don't do that, although there is something called the, quote, God Squad that can do that. Occasionally, the US government can convene to make exceptions to the Endangered Species Act. But generally speaking, the Endangered Species Act is, once it's listed, it's binding. Although in practice, since the federal agencies don't have like unlimited money or unlimited goodwill from the public, in practice, there's triage, right? There's triage in the sense of certain species get more attention than others, and certain species don't get a lot of attention at all. They're listed and in theory protected, but not being super taken care of. So every government's going to vary a little bit in how they do these things, but some of the laws that the US passed, either if it was early to the game or just because it's adopted things from other countries in turn, a lot of times you have similar kinds of laws across many different countries, even if the permutations look a bit different. So it's useful to know. All right, well, I'd like us to do a fun and or disturbing activity. I'd like you to lean back in your chair, close your eyes, and think, what if I was a dictator? Or maybe just, that's terrible. Don't be a dictator. Dictators are terrible. Maybe just be like a very unified government. The point is, you run the government for a day. What would you make environmental policy look like? What kinds of laws? What kinds of regulations? Would you use incentives like tax breaks maybe? Would you use the stick instead of the carrot, right? Would you use penalties, jail time or something, 10 years in jail for littering? Just kidding, don't do that. What do you protect? What kinds of things get protection under your perfect environmental policy? I think it's a useful thing to do and to think about. So sketch that out, okay? Think about it for a minute. Write it out. Do a really good job. Maybe draw some diagrams. Okay, now take that piece of paper and shred it to pieces and throw it on the ground and stomp on it, because that is not how environmental policy works in the real world. In the real world, the environmental policies and laws of any given nation are a product of twists and turns and roundabout circles and all sorts of things that have happened over decades, if not centuries. And it was almost never done with one person deciding at one time, let's make a really rational plan for how to preserve everything. And even if it was done that way, that itself could lead to huge problems. And so instead what we have in countries, and certainly what we have in the US, is a patchwork. Now, I tried to find a good image of a patchwork, because when I say a patchwork or a patchwork quilt, I think of this really patchy thing with a bunch of gaps in it and stuff, and it doesn't cover everything and you're going to get cold trying to wear it. But then I looked online and I realized oh, I don't know jack about quilting. Patchwork quilts just mean you use different patches. It doesn't mean that they're poorly constructed at all. They could be almost no seams. I mean, they have seams, but they could cover everything really well. So my metaphor kind of sucks. But we're going to go with it for now. So what I mean by a patchwork is that U.S. environmental policy does not cover everything, right? It does not cover every potential environmental thing we might want to preserve, nor does it cover any potential threat to those environmental things. And that partly reflects the fact that it was developed over time rather than all at once, and developed by a variety of different groups for a variety of different reasons. And that a lot of times it was reactionary, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but what I mean by that is that it was in response to something that came up, right? Very, very big environmental toxic sites became widely known in the 70s and 80s, and we got CERCLA, the Superfund Act, which works to clean up toxic sites. In the early 20th century, you had companies doing horrific things like putting sawdust to fill out certain kinds of food products, and so we had the rise of things like the FDA. So it's very much the case with environmental law, and you can see that by just looking at different kinds of law. So for example, land law. How we deal with public lands, the whole idea of a public land that can be protected or set aside for a national forest or something, is actually an outgrowth of, for example, in the US, the idea of crown land. When European settlers first got this land that belonged to the crown, to the king, right? And then sort of devolving into the idea of, U.S. government federal land, the things like the General Land Ordinance, the U.S. claiming a bunch of land and then using it for things like paying back soldiers that had fought in the Revolutionary War, and then eventually develops into our popular perception of public lands. And different governments have different histories with it, but it has, in our case, in the U.S.'s case, a very particular history. And a particularly fraught relationship with tribal land being claimed and then put into general land ownership. Sometimes by treaty, oftentimes by force. So that's one of the ways in which land law developed. And then we talked about before sort of Teddy Roosevelt and his buddies and how that further differentiated the different ways in which we manage lands, and the reason why we have lots of different land offices and not just one. Mining law, which also influences land law, has its own funky history, a lot of which has to do with stuff that was going on in the late 1800s and laws that were passed to regulate which rando gold miner got to claim this plot of land versus this plot of land. The original mining laws were not there to sort of protect the environment. Instead, the original mining laws were there to sort of figure out how to deal with competing economic claims over mineral resources. And over time, that's evolved and integrated with other laws. But it didn't start out that way, and that's one of the reasons why you sometimes get bizarre situations, like a company holding on to subsurface rights to an area for decades, right? And then resurrecting a mine or thinking about it, what we sometimes call zombie mines. Ooh. And then hunting law has its own funky history. We'll talk about that more in a couple weeks, so I won't belabor the point. But it has a lot to do with ideas that developed in the mid to late 1800s about what a proper hunter was and the sportsman's ethic and all these different things that eventually grew into certain kinds of restrictions that very much reflected hunting becoming a middle to upper class thing as opposed to a subsistence thing in parts of the US, and sort of the pushing out of subsistence users and also of commercial hunters, which used to be a thing much more than it is today. So none of those things, hunting law, land law, or mining law, or for that matter we could add pollution law, which partly comes out of public health law among other things, or we could talk about sort of power law, electricity law, industry law. None of these things were all done at once for the same reason, and so it makes a patchy sort of quality to it, where some things are protected a lot better than others. So, you end up in a situation where Endangered Species Act has much stiffer penalties than, for example, sacred site laws, as I've talked about before, or where certain things that seem like they should have a financial penalty to them, like violating NEPA, instead have an injunction attached to them, right? Different things developed at different times for different reasons. The overall trajectory, arguably, is pro-conservation, but as I put here, it's hardly unilinear, right? There's been starts and fits, and some people feel like there should be less regulation, of course. Under the Trump administration, they passed an executive order of, for every one new regulation, a repeal of 2 regulations, which I don't know that was ever consistently applied, but kind of, again, back to that idea of policy statements as not super binding always, but that idea of sort of regulation is too much, right? And that's a political conversation the US is still having. The land agencies, as we've talked about before, even them, right, come with a variety of different histories, right? Teddy Roosevelt and his boys, I say here jokingly. And then, of course, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has its own history and that I didn't pay a lot of attention to last time, but of course in Alaska is pretty powerful because we got some major-sized refuges, including Kenai National Wildlife Refuge, where I live. And lots of different sort of ideas, right, ranging from lots and lots of potentially private use, right, as something like 60% of BLM lands get grazed, are used by private ranchers, to sort of set the thing apart and only for tourism, to kind of a bit of a hybrid, to camping and hunting, basically, and hunting, but controlled hunting, controlled fishing. And so very different kind of ideas, because they were made for different things, right? They were made for the public enjoyment. They were made for the well-being of wildlife, particular for hunting, but all wildlife. They were made to preserve water quality and make sure that there was timber for it still in 100 years. And they were made basically as kind of a catch-all to figure out what to do with land that was in the public land space. Not only that, but then you have laws like this where you have what's called some of the agencies have what's called a multiple use mandate, especially BLM and Forest Service, which owns most of Alaska together, and or a large chunk of Alaska. And the multiple use mandate basically says that they need to manage for a lot of different uses. So mining, forestry, camping, endangered species protection, sustainable yield of many different sorts. Whereas something like the Fish and Wildlife Service, they do allow hunting and fishing. It's mainly for wildlife protection, though, whether it be, again, for sustained hunting, but not for, like, mining or something. Not to say that that can't happen on refuge lands, but to say that it's not their main objective there. And very much these different agencies are managed by their overarching objectives, as well as local things like their regional forest plan. So you need to understand that if you go to work for one of these agencies, or if you're an NGO or a corporation or something, you need to understand what their bottom line is, which is often prescribed very strictly by policy and law, right? And so it's not just sort of free agents that can just do whatever they want based on what, rando forest chief thinks is the right choice. Instead, they've got policies and laws they got to follow and like overarching management goals. All right, that's what I wanted to say about U.S. environmental policy.